evening. My name is Martin Conway from Contomac. Welcome to the online version of CLASS 2020. My presentation this evening is entitled The RGP Evolution from Basics to Future Developments, and I hope you enjoy. I know it's probably not your favourite subject, but I'd start off with a brief explanation of some of the terminology that you might hear when we're talking about contact lens materials. I'm calling it chemistry basics, and we're starting off with the humble carbon atom. Carbon is essential to life on Earth. It's the fourth most abundant element on the planet, and its success depends upon its ability to be able to bond with up to 4 different elements. There's 4 covalent bonds. It easily forms chains, and these carbon chains are the basic building blocks of amino acids that later go on to form proteins. And so all life on Earth is based upon carbon. You've probably heard the expression that we are a carbon-based life form, and it's because of carbon's unique characteristics that make it suitable. So all of the materials that we make, it's all organic chemistry, and carbon will be at the heart of it. So let's look at a few other terms that you'll come across. Monomer, cross-linker, initiator and polymer. These are all terms that you'll hear when in textbooks and in magazines referring to contact lens materials that you may have seen but not necessarily heard of exactly what they are and what they mean, what part they play in the finished article. So let's go through and discuss each of these in turn, then I promise you we'll get onto the materials themselves. This is a monomer. A monomer, mono as the name suggests, is one single unit. It's a molecule. It is the basic ingredient of the materials that we make. And at the head of it, there's our favourite carbon atom. And it's bonded to the rest of the molecule, which might consist of all sorts of different elements, but it'll be bonded with a double secure bond. A cross-linker, on first appearance, looks very much like a monomer. We have our carbon atom at the top. It's bonded to the rest of the molecule with a double bond. But if you look at the bottom, we have another carbon atom. The carbon atom at the top will bond onto a growing chain, a growing polymer chain of carbon atoms. But at the bottom now we have a spare carbon atom that looks to hook on to another carbon chain, and in doing so pulls the whole matrix of the polymer together. So the cross-linker's function really is to tighten up the matrix of the polymer that we're trying to develop. The more cross-linker you put in, the tighter the bonds, the tighter the matrix of the material. And a typical cross-linker would have at least 2 carbon atoms, but it may have up to 4. We need something to get the whole process going. This is the initiator. It's almost like a molecular hand grenade. It's extremely unstable. These chemicals have to be stored at low temperature because the slightest input of energy, whether that come in the form of heat or ultraviolet, will cause them to break down. One form of initiator is benzyl peroxide, and we can see that here. When heat is added to this molecule, the oxygen to oxygen bond is broken, forming a free radical. This radical can then react with the double bond of the monomer chain, linking the initiator fragment to the monomer. The reactive site moves to the end of the chain and the whole process continues. So if we look at that now, the finished polymer, we can see that we have our carbon atoms there, and at the end, shown as a red dot, is our free radical, the loose bond that's attracting another carbon atom that comes along. It's so reactive that it breaks that double bond and links that monomer now to the end of the polymer chain. And we now have a spare bond at the end of the chain, another reactive free radical that's looking to add. And this is how polymer chains develop. So we understand the importance of carbon in the organic chemistry, that is what's forming our material chemistry. And we now know what a monomer is, what a cross-linker does, the initiator, and how that forms the end polymer. We'll now move on to look at manufacturing of these chemicals. The manufacturing process begins with mixing the various raw ingredients together, the various monomers that we described earlier. Up to 12 different monomers may be involved in making a modern material, although they can start with just one monomer, one raw ingredient. For example, the basic PMMA, the polymethyl methacrylate, that the original hard lenses were made of, Perspex, was just one material. Hydroxyethyl methyl methacrylate, HEMA as you know it, again was just one raw ingredient, hydroxyethyl methacrylate. Although modern materials have many more ingredients involved, and they're called copolymers because they're co-polymerized different monomers together. The formulation, once it's been mixed and thoroughly stirred, is then poured into molds about 1/2 meter in length. And these are filled almost to the top. Those molds are then sealed and put into vats that you can see here on the right. We add the initiator at the time of mixing. This initiator, that if you remember, is this very unstable compound that once we apply heat or UV is going to break down and start the chemical reaction. So in this case, because of the high volumes involved, we are actually using heat as the trigger. So we gradually raise the temperature of the baths pumping warm water around until we start the temperature at which the polymerization process commences. Once we trigger that, it's very much self-fulfilling, that process, that polymerization as the chains join together, more or less carries on of its own accord. In fact, it's exothermic. It gives out heat. Now, the chemists will actually, in their ingredients, in their recipe for each polymer, they will actually describe exactly what temperature they want the polymerization to take place at different stages of the polymerization process. Because as we have 12 different monomers, each one may prefer to polymerize at a different temperature. So they will stay in these baths for up to 4 days while this polymerization takes place. So it's quite a lengthy process. And the temperature is controlled constantly 24 hours a day during that process. At the end of that process, polymerization is complete. That liquid monomer within the rod is now a solid. It's a solid rod, rather like a stick of rock. During the polymerization process, stresses build up. If you can imagine, this chemistry is changing within the rod and tension builds up in much the same way as you do when you heat a lens, a spectacle lens, to induce toughening. Although there's not enough tension, there's not enough internal pressures to actually warp the rod itself. By the time that rod was cut into thin slivers, and those slivers were then cut down to make a contact lens, there may well be enough internal stress to actually twist the polymer and induce unwanted aberrations in the finished lens. So we need to remove that stress. And what we do is we raise the temperature. We put the rods in these ovens, we raise the temperature to almost melting point, and then we allow them to cool very, very slowly. It's called an annealing process, and that releases all the inner tension within the rod and then allows it to settle and finish the manufacturing process without any internal stresses. At the same time, we apply a vacuum to those ovens so that any monomer that has been unpolymerized, that isn't actually tied into a chain, is removed from the process so that it's not left in the material to irritate the eye when the lens is put into the eye at the end of the process. So this process can take up to 48 hours. Those rods are then placed into these automatic lathes, There's a whole floor in Contomac with these automatic lathes. Rods can be loaded in, I think about 24 at a time, can be loaded in. And these lathes are run 24 hours a day. They're virtually unattended. They can be left overnight to continue running. The rods are then finished down the side to give you a uniform thickness, and they're cut into buttons that you can see here. Now these are typical buttons that the manufacturer receives to actually make hydrogel lenses, silicon hydrogel and RGP, both normal corneal, ortho-K, sclerals. They all come out of similar buttons, sometimes different sizes. These aren't for show, these are genuine buttons. The various tints look very bright, but by the time they're a solid tint, so by the time you cut them down to contact lens size, the tint appears just like a normal handling tint. I'd like now to look at what governs the properties that we try to imbibe into the materials that we make. When we're fitting contact lenses, there are three major concerns that we have about the property of the lens and the effect on the patient. Well, obviously, the whole purpose of fitting them with contact lenses is to achieve good vision. Has to be done in a reasonable degree of comfort, such as the patient can enjoy wearing them or can wear them. And underlying all of this, we have to maintain the ocular health. We have to maintain the health of the cornea. Let's go back and look at rigid lenses then, right at the very beginning. Again, we have vision, comfort and health to think about. The original PMMA, as far as vision was concerned, gave excellent vision. It's a very hard material. It can be very highly polished to give us a very good optical surface, although comfort was initially poor. Patients typically would wear the lenses for just half an hour the first day and would have to build up and extend their wearing time by just half an hour a day. So the process of getting up to all-day wear could easily take 3 weeks to a month. Have to be very, very cautious, and the reason for that is no oxygen. So there were always some concerns about the health of the eye underneath the PMMA lens. The way we achieve oxygen permeability in both RGP lenses and hydrogel lenses to make them silicon hydrogel is, as the name implies, to introduce silicon. Silicon has been well known for its oxygen transporting properties, and the specific molecule that is used in RGP and basic silicon hydrogels is called tris. And tris is short for trimethylsiloxysilane, for those of you who wish to try your tongue twister skills, otherwise known as tris. And it principally involves increasing the oxygen permeability and also the flexibility of the lens, the bendiness of the lens. If we look at how it works, this is the molecule that's known as tris. And you can see it consists of carbon, oxygen and silicon atoms. There's a basic carbon again. When we're looking at how these atoms link together, they're the bonds that join them. There's a bond length and a bond angle. And if we can look at the various bond lengths and angles, you can see that between carbon to carbon, we have 1.54 angstrom. Carbon to oxygen 1.43, but when we look at silicon, how it bonds to oxygen, we can see there's 1.63 angstrom. So it's much longer bond length between the silicon and oxygen atom in this molecule. Then we look at the bond angle, which is the angle between the bonds, and again you can see at 130 degrees the silicon oxygen bond is much wider than the other bonds. And it's this combination of increased bond length as well as increased bond angle that opens up the matrix of the molecule and allows oxygen to pass through in much the same way as if we widen the holes in a fishing net. Unfortunately, silicon has some unwanted side effects in as much that it is basically hydrophobic. It repels water, whereas mostly with a contact lens we want to use hydrophilic monomer. By introducing silicon, we introduce a hydrophobic element and an element within the lens that's actually going to encourage drying. And this drying can attract deposits on the surface of the lens, so we need to counteract that in some way. The other side effect that we should be aware of is the fact that silicon in hard lenses can actually make the material more flexible. PMMA on its own is a very rigid material, which is ideal for a contact lens. But as we introduce silicon, it can make the lens flex more. To counteract the wettability issues, we introduce the use of hydrophilic monomers to counteract the hydrophobic tendency of silicon. And one such molecule is methacrylic acid. And you can see here we measure the wettability of a surface by a thing called wetting angle. On the far left, you can see an extremely dry surface, which is resisting the natural tendency of the weight of the water droplet to spread over its surface. The wetter the surface becomes, the more readily the spread of the water droplet over the surface, until on the far right we see the extreme wettability. And it's the angle that this droplet forms against the surface that determines how wettable the surface is. It's called the wetting angle. And generally, the lower the wetting angle, the wetter the surface. So when you're choosing a material, we're really looking to get one with the lowest wetting angle possible. How do we reduce the deposits element of silicon? Well, in the late 1930s, a young chemist working for the DuPont company in the United States was trying to develop a new refrigerant. And he didn't succeed, but what he did succeed in developing was what we now know as Teflon. And the element that he was playing around with was fluorine. So he discovered that certain fluorines resist deposits adhering to them, the non-stick frying pan. And so what we actually do is we include these fluorine elements within the material. So we have methacrylic acid, hydrophilic acids to improve wettability, and we add fluorines to actually increase deposit resistance. So a modern GP lens will now be a fluorosilicon acrylate. So it will have fluorine in it, it will have hydrophilic monomers, methacrylic acid normally, as well as the basic methacrylate. Why do we bother having a gas permeable lens? As I said, people wore PMMA lenses. The original Polycon lens was designed with a DK not much more than 5, which seems laughable when we're talking these days of DK over 100 regularly in use. But the initial Polycon lens was developed by a company called Syntex in the early 70s. And in 1977, a researcher called Ken Pulse in the United States took 46 patients who had been fitted with basic PMMA lenses unsuccessfully, and he refitted them. He used exactly the same design of lens from the same manufacturers, but he had them made using this new gas permeable material, Polycon. Of the 46 patients that were refitted, 67%, which I think was 32 patients, successfully wore the lens. That's the degree of difference that it made. Even that small amount of DK, that small amount of oxygen permeability, increased the success of those patients that were formerly unable to wear lenses. So at that point, the race was on. The key was recognized to be oxygen permeability. So manufacturers set out to drive as much oxygen through the lens as possible. If we look at what we have now, the existing GP materials, you can see now that we have a wide range of oxygen permeabilities available to us. From back in the early days of Polycon at just single digit and early teens, they now go up to well in excess of 100 DK. This is achieved with a range of different ingredients. Up to 12 different monomers now go into manufacturing a modern polymer to give you the range of material characteristics that you want in terms of wettability, in terms of flexibility, and in terms of optical ability. So we've looked at RGP development from the basic monomer of PMMA, which is polymethyl methacrylate. And then with the addition of silicon, we obtained decay, we obtained oxygen permeability. With the addition of fluorine, we enabled them to become deposit resistant. And with the addition of methacrylic acid and other hydrophilic monomers, we made the surfaces wettable. So the modern GP is both high permeability, high deposit resistance, and highly wettable, and is worn overnight in some cases for orthokeratology, and is available in a range of different powers and sizes, from ordinary corneal lenses to lenses for the correction of keratoconus, right through to the more up-to-date scleral lenses. Brief advertisement now. This is I want to explain one facet of GP lenses. This is our Optimum range. And you'll see underneath the Optimum the branding there for Comfort, Extra and Extreme. There's another rather weird name, Roflifocon C, Roflifocon D and Roflifocon E. This Roflifocon adage is called the United States adopted name. It's given to polymers by the US FDA. And you'll note here that we've got C, D and E. Now they all share the same Roflifocon name, which means they all share identical ingredients. Now, as I said, there's up to 12 different ingredients, and it's exactly the same as cooking a cake, yet they all have different characteristics. And if we look here, we can see that across the Optimum Comfort, Optimum Extra and Optimum Extreme, we have a range of oxygen permeabilities. The DK varies from 65 through 100 up to 125, and yet we're all using the same ingredients. Refractive index varies, so does the hardness and even the specific gravity of the lens. And this is achieved, although the chemists are using the same monomers, the same amount of ingredients, by adjusting the proportions of those ingredients. The modern polymer chemists can adjust the outcome, so you can pick and choose. And this is the skill of the polymer chemist. So the range may share the same use and name of Roflifocon, but each one will have slightly different characteristics for the practitioner to select from. So let's look now at RGP lenses generally. Vision is good because we have a hard, highly polished optical surface, so the optical characteristics are excellent. Comfort is much improved over the basic PMMA lens, so we can see success rates are much, much higher, and patients can wear them for much longer periods, even overnight. And health is excellent. It's even greater than with a soft lens. A study back in 2008 by Stapleton and others showed that GP lenses has the lowest rate of microbial infection of all types of contact lens wear, and that remains the case now. So that's a brief overview of RGP development over the years up until about 2019. But more recently, there's been a movement in the marketplace for the introduction of hyper decay materials. So let's look first of all whether there is actually a need for these materials in the marketplace when we've been doing so well with traditional RGP materials for all this length of time. So is there a need? Well, mainly we've also seen changes in the marketplace with a growing interest in the use of ortho-K, both for normal correction of myopia and other conditions, but mainly when people think of ortho-K, they tend to think of myopia control or myopia management, whichever term you prefer. We must also remember that if a lens is to be left in overnight, it needs to supply more oxygen to the cornea than when it's used in daily wear. Daily wear criteria from Holden Mertz is 24, But for overnight, that creeps up to 87, a figure of over 3 times the value for daily wear. There's been also a market growth in the use of scleral lenses over the past 10 years. These lenses tend to be thicker. If you thicken the lens, you increase the T, you reduce the decay over T, getting through to the cornea underneath. They also tend to be fitted with a much higher volt than a GP lens, and so the barrier of the tear lens, the liquid lens to the cornea, is also needed to be included in that equation. It's a sealed cornea. There's a sealed tear reservoir underneath the lens, which isn't being replenished by fresh tears during the day's wear. Both of these new modalities use RGP materials, which would lend us to believe that there is a need for a higher decay material on the marketplace. Orthokeratology in particular is used, as I said earlier, mainly for children. These are young eyes that hopefully are going to be on this planet for some time, and we're going to put these lenses into these eyes overnight. So we should be especially careful that we give more than adequate oxygen to meet the needs of the cornea in this young developing eye. Scleral lenses are typically 300 to 350 microns thick, which is at least double that of a typical GP lens. And so already we halve the amount of oxygen coming through the material. They cover all of the cornea. There is no movement, so there's no replenishment of the tear layer. And that tear layer is much thicker than would be normally used under a typical GP lens. Even if the lens skims the surface, as it is in this slide showing a keratoconic eye, we can see that the tear reservoir is much, much thicker in other areas of the cornea. In this case, it's probably closer to 500 microns in certain areas. So we've established there is a need, but how much oxygen do we need to get through? We've already established that for daily wear, we need a decay over T of 24. That was established some time ago by the Holden-Mertz paper published in 1982. But in 2012, Longis Michaud, a well-known Canadian researcher, foresaw this difficulty coming in the use of scleral lenses. And he mathematically calculated for us the need of a material suitable for scleral lenses. His paper was published in 2012, and what he did was mathematically calculate the decay required of a lens of certain thickness fitted at a certain volt. Here in the chart, you can see that those figures in the darker hashing are impossible to make. They're minus figures. In the lighter shading, it would be possible for a laboratory to make a lens of that thickness, but it would be impractical in use. The lens would flex or even break. So we're left with those figures on the white background as being lenses that would be possible to manufacture. If we were to fit a lens at the normal sort of clearance of 150 to 200 microns, and if we were to fit it of a regular sort of thickness of 280 to 380 microns, which is typical for most designs out there, Longis calculated that we'd need a material with a decay of about 170. So this gave Contumac its target range for the development of this material. If we look at current materials, we can see there is a range of products on the marketplace. They range from lower teens, 12 decays, right through matching the development of the material through to 140, 150 plus. Most of those use conventional tris silicon, which I described in the earlier part of the presentation. There is one lens out there, though, that actually uses a different form of tris. And this tris gives the lens a much higher decay than conventional tris, and also makes the lens more stable and more rigid. And so that appears to be the direction we needed to travel in to look at this material. The material is called styral tris. It's conventional tris with a styral group embedded in the molecule, which you can see here in this hexagonal shape embedded in it. Has more or less the same molecular mass as conventional tris and the same number of silicon and oxygen bonds of 6. So how does it actually maintain its rigidity and also transmit more oxygen than conventional tris? If we compare the two molecules, you can see that the conventional tris here on the left-hand side is a much more spindly shape, whereas styral tris is a much more rigid, geometric shape of the molecule. And we think that plays a part. Also, the styral grouping, that hexagonal group that you can see at the bottom, also offers some rigidity, and its very shape allows more oxygen to pass through the matrix of the material. So the challenge was to develop a material that was styral tris based. It was rigid, came with the territory. It was wettable though. We wanted to develop a material that did not need extra plasma treatment or any surface treatments, could be used by the laboratory from the laboratory. And also we wanted to develop a hard surface. The previous incarnations have perhaps suffered from softer surface and easier scratching. The result was the Optimum Infinite. It is styral tris based, it is rigid, wettable, does not need plasma treatment, has a hard surface, is a scratch resistant at a conventional GP material, and it has a decay of 180. Okay, we've looked at material developments coming in the near future. Let's have a look and see if there are any other future developments that we need to be aware of in the field of RGP materials. A recent development is the treatment of the surface of lens materials with revolutionary new hydrophilic coatings, such as the HydroPEG coating. Here we see an untreated lens on the left versus a treated lens on the right. If we now look at that most hydrophobic of materials, pure silicon, here we see a silicon lens on the left and a treated silicon lens on the right. Quite dramatic differences in the hydrophilic surface. On the left here, we have an untreated RGP scleral lens on an eye, obviously a greasy eye. And this is the same lens, same design, same material in a HydroPEG treated lens. So these treatments, these surface treatments, can make a significant difference to both the comfort and wearability of new hyper-decay materials. We can see the use of these coatings extending into the future as new improvements are made, solutions coming along to sustain the coating in use, and possible development of coatings embedded within the material itself. In another experiment with HydroPEG, we see the effects of the treatment on surface deposition. Here we have an untreated lens, dipped first in a dyed lipid solution to demonstrate, then a plasma treated lens dipped into the same solution. You can see virtually no difference, and the HydroPEG treated lens dipped first into the lipid, and you can see hardly any lipid adhering to the surface of the lens. These types of products are going to make significant differences to the way compromised corneas in particular can wear scleral lenses in the future. Other developments are going to come in the field of topographical information. Current topographies really only give us centralized information out to about 9 millimeters. But as we've seen earlier in the presentations, these improved data that we're getting out to about 22 millimeters will make a significant difference into the type of lenses that we can actually design and fit exactly to the patient's cornea. This lens here is a real lens prescribed and manufactured to the patient's exact requirements. And this is the type of lens that we can look forward to in the future, both for in the field of scleral lenses and also in ortho-K. So the future is looking rosy for RGP developments. We're suggesting that practitioners should move to hyper DKs for ortho-K lenses and scleral lenses for the reasons I've outlined. Think of surface treatments for those difficult patients or those patients having comfort or deposit issues, and really develop your practice by fitting more customized lenses. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in person at a later date. Thank you. Goodbye.